Welcome, dear viewers, to another transformative journey through the realms of spirituality. Today, we delve into a profound concept that has the potential to revolutionize the way we perceive and experience suffering. Join me as we explore the idea that 90% of our suffering is created by our minds, not external situations. How often do we find ourselves blaming external circumstances for our suffering? From challenging relationships to unforeseen events, the external world can indeed be tumultuous. However, what if I told you that the true source of our suffering lies not in these situations but in the way our minds perceive and react to them? To comprehend the roots of our suffering, we must first acknowledge that pain is an inevitable part of the human experience. However, what if I told you that the majority of our suffering doesn't come from external circumstances but is instead a creation of our minds? Let's explore this idea further. Suffering is a generic term that in spiritual traditions like Zen Buddhism is referred as to dukkha. It's a term used to describe suffering. As the Buddha said, no matter what you do and where you go, you encounter dukkha, meaning the situation you find yourself in makes you suffer again. Suffering in the language of spiritualism means to live in complete resistance or denial of what is. When I use the term suffering in this context, I'm referring to different forms of suffering that arise in various forms. For example, suffering can be in the form of anger, impatience, unhappiness, anxiety, frustration, irritation, depression, unease, and other forms. Humans embody this natural mechanism as part of the defensiveness or protection to deal with outside threats. Negative feelings are not designed for humans to contemplate. They are specifically designed to help us deal with the outer threats. Just like an animal that detects an outside threat, it runs with fear because it wants to survive. Nothing wrong with feeling anger because it is part of your defensive mechanism to protect you from threatening situations. Due to the thinking mind or misusing of our thoughts, we humans can make ourselves suffer by just thought alone. Our thoughts can make us sick if we are not careful. The reason why people suffer is because they are always in denial of the present moment. The present moment to some people is treated like an enemy. As long as the present moment is treated like an enemy, then suffering arises. It's not because the outside situation is what causes you to suffer. The thoughts about the situation are what cause a huge amount of suffering. The outside situation is just unfolding the way it was meant to be, only your mind resists it. You cannot control everything on the outside, but you can control how you respond to situations. The human mind creates 90% of suffering in this world, and the remaining 10% of suffering is created by outside circumstances, which has nothing to do with the mind. For example, when someone is attached to their past, they tend to believe that the past is what defines them. Some people are deeply identified with their past and they don't want to let it go. Instead of letting go of the past, they cling to it so hard to reaffirm their addiction to suffering. The present moment is always free from suffering, and only suffering exists in your mind. The tendency of the mind to deny, resist, or judge situations is what causes people to suffer unnecessarily. If someone is creating suffering for themselves through resistance to what is, it's more likely that they are going to project their suffering onto other people. You also make other people suffer. That's how dysfunctional humans are. There are two types of suffering in this world, which are the suffering created by your mind and the suffering created by the outside circumstances in which you don't have a contribution. Suffering created by your mind is just unnecessary baggage of mind activity that you carry around with you that you don't even need. I call it useless suffering. This type of suffering is created when someone is always living in denial of what is. This is where the present moment is always treated like an enemy, and a person constantly have a conflict within his or her mind regarding the situation he or she is facing. A person tends to resist the situation because he or she believes that the situation they are facing is not supposed to be happening, but it is happening. It is not the situation that is creating the suffering, it is your thoughts about the situation. The situation is just unfolding the way it was meant to be in the present moment, only the mind judges it or resists it to get into some future moment which never comes. For example, people ruminate about their past to create grief and depression. This form of suffering arises when you mentally project yourself into some past moment that never existed in the first place, but only to your mind. The past that a lot of people cling to is gone and cannot be changed, no matter how hard you try. This is unnecessary baggage of suffering that people carry around with them to make themselves miserable. You believe that the present moment is a threat to your existence, so you will rather cling to your past because somehow it makes you feel something, it gives you the sense of self. People are happy being unhappy and they don't even realize it. Another form of suffering that people create is when people project into the future moment. Anxiety, fear, worry, lack, and impatience arise because someone is mentally projecting or wants to get into some future moment because they believe that this moment is a threat. Future in simple terms means someone is here and they want to be there. You could be someone who always worries about what is going to happen in the future or becoming impatient in various situations, and this creates unnecessary anxiety or fear in your body, telling the body, "I'm in danger," even if nothing is happening on the outside, because the body cannot tell the difference between the outside event that is causing the emotion and what you are fabricating by thought alone. People tend to worry about what is going to happen in the future, and most of the things they are worrying about may not even happen. Even if they happen, why create unnecessary suffering before the event? If the situation arises at that moment, you would still deal with it with the power of presence. Some people call this normal way of living. The so-called normal way of living is just a dysfunction created by the mind to enhance further suffering. Another form of suffering that people create for themselves is when they resist small situations like standing in a grocery store, small accidents, losing small stuff, a person telling jokes, etc. This is why a lot of people tend to take things personally even if it is small. You will see a person becoming angry and frustrated because of the long line at a grocery store. A person becomes impatient or frustrated because they desperately want to get into the so-called future, which never comes but only is now. These forms of suffering arise because the present moment to some people is treated like an obstacle because they always want to get somewhere or avoid something. Now let's talk about the suffering created by the outside circumstances. Suffering created by your outside circumstances is the type of suffering in which you don't have a total contribution. Every person in this world goes through this type of suffering whether you like it or not. The reason why it's happening is because it's part of the growth in consciousness. These are the serious challenges of life that you cannot avoid because they force you to go within. Examples of suffering created by outside circumstances are things like natural disasters, illness, tragic loss, accidents, losing everything in your life, a life crisis, and so on. This type of suffering is what I can say, this is not your fault or your contribution because they are happening for a larger purpose, which is the evolution of consciousness. If not careful with your mind, the mind will turn these challenges into further suffering. Instead of accepting the suffering created by the outside circumstances, the mind might creep in and worsen the situation by adding more suffering to the situation. If you encounter suffering caused by outside circumstances, the only way to become free of that suffering is to surrender completely to what is, even if you don't like it. Don't allow the mind to add more fuel to that particular situation because you may end up in a very critical suffering state. Accept that these types of challenges happen to everyone and they are part of the human growth in consciousness. The ego, with its incessant need for validation and control, contributes significantly to our suffering. As we identify with the egoic mind, we become ensnared in a web of desires, fears, and attachments that amplify the impact of external circumstances on our well-being. In the landscape of our suffering, the 90-10 principle unfolds. 90% of our suffering arises from within, while only 10% is truly rooted in external circumstances. This profound realization becomes a beacon guiding us towards inner freedom and resilience. The antidote to the mind's creation of suffering is found in the power of presence. By anchoring ourselves in the present moment, we cultivate a space where external situations lose their grip on our inner peace. Presence becomes the key to unlocking the door to profound tranquility. Central to our journey is the art of letting go. Letting go of attachments, expectations, and the incessant need for control allows us to dance with the rhythm of life. It's through letting go that we free ourselves from the mind's habitual patterns that contribute to our suffering. In our quest for liberation, it's crucial to approach the mind with compassion. Instead of viewing the mind as an adversary, we can become allies, fostering a relationship that nurtures healing and transformation. Self-compassion becomes the balm that soothes the wounds of the mind. Our minds often operate in habitual patterns, replaying familiar stories and responses. Through conscious awareness and intentional shifts in perspective, we can break free from these patterns, creating space for new, empowering narratives that lead to greater joy and fulfillment. As we conclude our journey into the liberation of the mind, envision a life lived in harmony with the present moment. A life where the mind serves as a tool for creativity and understanding rather than a source of unnecessary suffering. Together, let's step into the liberated realm of spiritual awakening. Thank you for accompanying me on this extended exploration into the nature of suffering and the liberation of the mind. May the insights gained here serve as beacons on your path to inner freedom. Remember, the journey continues and each moment holds the potential for profound transformation. Until we meet again, stay present, stay mindful, and embrace the beauty of a liberated mind. This is Change Your Life, signing off with deep gratitude and profound blessings. Peace.